Hello there. My name is Gregory Ellis. I'm a dentist here in Rutland, Vermont, and I'd like to introduce to you a very crafty young gentleman, George Leitch. George, how are you?
How do you do? You're now looking at one of my hobbies, which I took up after I retired about 24 years ago, and found it very, very rewarding.
And I'm here to kind of ask George a whole bunch of questions relative to model building, specifically as it relates to shipbuilding. It's been a love of mine over the years to be involved with this kind of thing, although my experience is somewhat limited. And we hope to do with these series of shows is to kind of walk you through model building, because it's really fascinating if you're at all interested in miniaturization and working with your hands in very small detail. And what I'm going to be doing today is asking George some questions relative to model building and shipbuilding and specifically, and to give you some a feeling for the love and craft that goes into something like this. It just mind boggles folks to think about all the work that goes in, hours and hours of work and love that goes into something like this. Would you agree with that, George, or do you have a special feeling for how this feels when you're working on a ship?
Well, I think it all starts with having to have a love of the sea and the love of ships. And I have owned 4 sailing vessels of my own and done a lot of sailing. And then I find history tremendously interesting. And the men who these ships were built for, kings in some cases, and pirates for others, all make interesting reading.
That's spent on a ship. I think that's probably one of the first questions that any amateur might have is, okay, I want to build a ship, George. How many hours should I devote to a project like this? Or should I even start with something like this if I'm a beginner?
First of all, if you're a beginner, you don't want to start with anything as complicated as this ship here. The people who manufacture kits for building ships classify them in groups as to their degree of skill required. The ship in front of me is a Class C, which requires the largest amount of skill that there is. The other ships are less complicated, and for a beginner, he certainly should start with smaller and more simple construction. And then as he gathers his experience with the tools and the methods of fastening, then advance to the larger, more complicated ships.
We're talking about the ship in front of us, and maybe we ought to identify what it is.
This ship was built about 1600 for the King of Spain. And while it's built as a warship, it was really just a floating palace for the king. Several other kings also had similar ships that never were really warships. They were all equipped, but they were just royal barges. One of the most famous ones is one that was built for the King of Sweden, and that sunk at the dock after they launched it because of the crowd of visitors that came on board. And the thing that makes that interesting was that it lay submerged for about 200 years, and when it was raised, it was in very good shape.
Oh, just to hear the stories behind some of these ships is quite fascinating. I wish we had a lot more time to get into some of the history involved. Maybe we can go around this basement where George has several other models that he's put together. We can kind of get a feel for some of the other kinds of ships that George has built, and maybe give us a little history about each one, George, if you will. Something that might have came to light in your mind as you were putting these together, and describe a little of the story behind the building of them. Right behind this ship is another. Want to describe this one for us, George?
Well, this is probably one of the most well-known of these old ships. It's a model of the old Constitution, which is now permanently in Boston Harbor. It is still in active service in the United States Navy. It's a very popular visiting place, and it's kept up in very good shape. One of the things they have to do each year is to take the ship from its present mooring and turn it around so that the sun beats on the opposite side of the ship and does its work there in deteriorating some, but they rotate it every year.
I didn't realize that. Yeah, I've driven into Boston many times and seen it in its harbor, and actually walked on board while they were reconstructing it. I thought I recognized it. As in both of these vessels, there are numerous cannons, and some of them are in the first and second decks of the ship. Are those on their own decks inside here, George, or are they just placed in their portholes?
The cannons are all on their own mounts, and there are, I believe, some 92 cannons on the old Ironside.
I don't know if we can get a closer shot of some of the intricate small detail here. Maybe we can cut and see if we can get a little closer. Well, as you might be able to see on your screen here, we have the top deck of the Constitution, and wanted to point out that each of the cannons is on its own mount, and those are tied down to the ship's deck via hand-done roping, which, if you get a feel for all of the rigging detail here, it's all done by hand. There's not much glue here involved at all, which requires a lot of manual dexterity, George, on your part. Is this all done with just fingers, or did you use other things?
In the course of building the ship, you have occasion to use many fine tools, various knife blades and various sized drills are used, and a wide assortment of files are used, tapered files, triangular files, and so forth, to get in and out of hard-to-reach places. These cannons were held by the ropes to the deck, and by a series of pulleys. And when the cannon was fired, the recoil brought the whole cannon back, at which point the men came forward with swabs that were wet to swab out the cannon to make sure there was no live sparks left in the cannon at the time they reloaded it. After that, the ball and wadding were pressed into place. The cannon was discharged by a priming powder that was put in a pinhole on top of the cannon, and this was often ignited by a pistol by one of the officers after the gun had been sighted.
Again, if we can get a shot of some of the detail here, we have the rigging, which is, for me, is really a lot of fun. And in putting together a very small model of the Constitution myself out of plastic, I remember the kit that I had the block and tackles were just kind of globs of plastic, and we glued the rigging to the blocks of plastic. But here we have actual wooden blocks, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, they all work too, which is all done by hand. And get into some of the detail here, you can see that each one has its own hole to allow the lines to go through, and then they're tied down to the mast. And again, George, those holes these were all done by hand, right? They were all not prefabricated. The blocks.
The blocks are usually cut off from a round, and then in the case of the blocks that tighten up the...
Talking about the details and how much experience you need to put together these ships, and I was just telling George that when you see something this grand in front of you, you say, that's the one I want to do because it looks so beautiful. And as we were saying earlier on, you really shouldn't tackle something that complicated. But George tells a cute story about his first ship.
Well, I was attracted by the detail on the Nelson's flagship, the Victory, and that was a large model, which is a Class C model, and of the greatest difficulty, and that is the one I selected to build for the first time. Needless to say, I ran into all sorts of difficulties, but eventually came out with what I thought was a very good job. But several years later, looking back at it, I asked myself, did I create this monstrosity?
Maybe we can go take a look at it. Is this a good time to go run and take a look at the Victory? Yeah. Here we are in front of the HMS Victory that George says is his first ship. If this is an example of what you don't do, this is just as gorgeous, which tells me a lot about your innate talents here, George. He says he built this 12 years ago, so it sounds like George has been in model building not all that long. Want to give us a little bit about what went into this one, George?
One thing perhaps that's worth mentioning is the reason for the copper on the bottom of the ships. These ships were, of course, saltwater ships, and there is a marine worm known as the torpedo worm, which bores holes in the wood in ships. So that portion of these ships that were below the waterline were subjected to being eaten away and rotted away by this torpedo worm. And in due time, they learned how to fasten copper plates, copper sheets, to protect these hulls from this torpedo worm. Prior to the use of the copper, the ships had to be driven up on the shore. All of the heavy equipment, the cannons and all the equipment, the stores and everything unloaded. Ropes were then tied to the top of the mast, and the ships were keeled over on their sides, and all the barnacles and the seaweed and all that stuff had to be scraped off and removed by hand. There was down in Antigua, there was a place called Nelson's Harbor, which was used by the British Navy for cleaning their ships. The reason for selecting that is that it's a small island. It had only a narrow channel to get into a harbor. On each side of the channel were high hills which were easily fortified, so that when a ship was in there being refitted, it could not be caught off guard by some enemy ship.
This is just a beautiful model. Quite a history. Did you have a lot of your own tools, George, or did you use what is done in the hobby industry now and use tools that were purchasable through hobby stores?
I had nothing but a tack hammer. So needless to say, the companies that supply these model kits also supply a wide variety of specialized tools, including special vices and so forth, which are necessary for holding. And that's where I bought my supplies, tools, a few at a time.
One of the things about shipbuilding and model building is when you have it all finished and display it out for everyone to see, the work is really not ended. You really have to maintain the ship and keep it clean. You want to describe how that's accomplished, George?
For these ships are great dust gatherers, and today you can buy these little hand vacuum cleaners with a little attachment on them, and that's very good for going up and down the rigging and around the ships to remove most of the dust. The rigging itself has to be carefully selected because it's subjected to dampness. You can rig a ship up all taut and nice, and then during the changes in the weather and so forth, the rigging all becomes loose. In other cases, if you're using another type of rigging, and you get everything all tightened up, your rigging shrinks and actually pulls away your fittings and so forth and causes quite a mess. So one of the best ways to prevent that is to use a beeswax and take all your lines and carefully coat them with beeswax before you install them.
Yeah, I can see an example of what happened with taut lines and slacking lines down here in the bow of the ship. George, how many hours did it take you to put together this?
I worked on these ships for about 2 hours a day, and this one in front of us now, the Victory, I was about 2 years in completing it, and others were somewhat less time.
What patience and dedication, huh? What did you do before you started doing shipbuilding? I know you must have earned a living in some way, George. Tell our viewers what you did for a living.
Well, during the war, I was a member of the research group known as the National Defense Research Commission. After the war was over, I found myself in Springfield, Vermont, where we were working on an armor-piercing gun with the barrel of the gun being tapered and being done at the Jones and Lamson Company there, because they were the only ones that had a lathe capable of this taper boring. After the war was over and our research group was dissolved, I went to work as metallurgist for Fellows Gear Shaper for 25 years until my retirement.
Did you get a chance to use your hands in such detail in your job, or how did you come upon your skill in small detail?
One of the reasons I took to using my hands was that all my life I'd had a job that required not much more than holding myself on a chair to keep from falling out. So that when I had a chance to actually use my hands and work manually, I found it very, very interesting.
What I would call a sloop. George has a very interesting story to tell about it.
Well, this is an armed vessel which was built for the privateering trade in this country with money that was raised in France by Ben Franklin. And this group of investors built this ship primarily to raid the British commerce in the North Sea. She was built for speed, and as you can see, to the eye, she is top heavy. She is carrying far too much canvas for the size of the hull. This was deliberately done to give her speed. However, this speed was her undoing, because after capturing about 12 ships in the North Atlantic, she was caught in a storm, and before they could get the sails in, the ship sunk. She had an active life of only about 3 weeks, during which time she captured 10 prizes, and every time they captured a prize, of course, they had to put some of their own men on board to sail the ship back to a neutral port. They took so many prizes and depleted their crews to the extent that one of the prizes was sent in under the command of an 8-year-old midshipman.
We're sitting in front or behind another ship that has a lot of copper on it. You want to describe this one for us?
This is a model of the Cutty Sark, a British ship built on the Clyde in Scotland about 1840. And she's a type of clipper ship that was used in the China trade between 1840 and 1860.
Known for speed, I understand.
These ships carried a lot of sail, and today's racing yachts, the 8-meter class and so forth, are known for speed, but when they're talking speed, they're talking about 8 knots. This ship, on one of the trips back from China, over a period of about 5 weeks, logged over 14 knots and made the fastest crossing ever.
I don't know if you can see it on your screens, but we also have the ship on top of another nautical item. This is a copy of a hatch cover that the coffee table's made. Okay, I think we're going to go over and see again the Spanish galleon ship, and we can close up the show from there. Well, we're back here at the Spanish ship that George was describing earlier, and want to thank you for describing the models that you have put together here, George, and what we're hoping to do and accomplish here is to whet an appetite out there in the viewing audience. We have a very strong interest amongst ourselves to show you what's involved in putting together ships like this, and we're going to walk you through the creation of such a model, and in general hope to expand the idea into model building of all kinds, be it ships, be it airplanes, cars, etc. And what I'm asking of those who are viewing, if you've got any interest at all in this hobby, we'd like to hear from you. And the best way to do that is to call, Misty, shh, quiet, is to call Joe Courcelle. His number is 747-4711, or the Adelphia Cable location here in Rutland, and let us know of your interest. And you can be involved in any which way you seem to think you would be appropriate for you, whether it be actual building the ships, or model making, or just an eager participant and viewer. But we'd like to hear from you. We all have this love of miniaturization and model building, and shipbuilding in its grandest is perfectly exemplified by what you see here, and George's knowledge of shipbuilding is going to be part of this series. And we'd like to thank you again, George, for your input, and hope to see your hands at work.